rise in this place on behalf of the wonderful people of Long Island and to follow my good cousin, the member for South Beach, who showed some of that Long Island flair just now. Madam Speaker, I want to begin by acknowledging a few of my constituents and by giving condolences to a number of persons who have had family members pass on in recent days and weeks. Madam Speaker, I want to extend condolences to the family, the children, and the wider family of Miss Alice Miller. And so to Stafford and Ralph, Belly, and Neil, my condolences. To the family of Mr. Mitchell Dean. Mr. Mitchell Dean is a very popular musician on the island. I don't know if there are many people who could play that bass guitar like him, but I think he plays multiple instruments. So to his children, to Mr. Mitchell Dean, his family, his children, and all of the members of the Originals Rake and Scrape Band, I extend my condolences. To the family of Mr. John Roos Burroughs, his wife Maria, his children Dwight, Michelle, and Gidget, I extend my sympathies to you. To the family of Mr. John Hunt, to his wife Tamika Hunt, and the kids, please have my deepest sympathies. And also to the family of Mr. Wayne Darville. You know, Madam Speaker, we've lost quite a number of persons in recent weeks. in recent weeks, we've lost quite a number of persons. We still have some. But to the family of Mr. Wayne Darville, to the family of Mr. Lenny Lopez, and lastly to the family of Mr. Reggie Rigby, his wife Louise, and I believe Mr. Rigby is the uncle of the member for South Beach. Madam Speaker, I also want to recognize and congratulate some of the young stars, the superstars that are coming up in Long Island. We have some high school scholars. Recently came to Nassau, attended a function by the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity at Conclave in Nassau. The Carrie Tanquest, Chandra Wilson, both of those are from NGM Major, and Cadian Scherer from the North Long Island High School. The Carrie actually finished second overall. These are some of the brilliant minds that we are producing out of Long Island who will be leaders to come in short course. I also want to congratulate Mr. Crisco Cartwright. You know, his mom, she's a ardent supporter of Crystal, and his dad, Colin. Crisco is a grade 12 student. He won second overall in the Class E boat race in Georgetown, Exuma. You know, he's the son of Colin and Crystal Cartwright, as I said earlier. You know, Madam Speaker, we usually dominate Exuma. We did dominate, but you know, whatever we didn't pick up in Exuma, we'll pick up in a month in Long Island. So everybody could come on down. Madam Speaker, Long Island has seen a huge regression since the 2021 general elections. And we have, excuse me, what's the time? We have, well, you know, the MP is in opposition. You all in government. So help me. Help me. Help me. And that's why I'm here now to advocate. But we have seen a huge regression since 2021. Madam Speaker, we have serious challenges with banking on the island. Scotia, they pulled out. They took out their fixed location, brick and mortar, and they left an ATM there, which we were grateful for. However, we've discovered in recent weeks that the ATM is down most times, and islanders are quite disadvantaged by that fact. And so we are in desperate need of banking facilities in the island. You know, right now that's having a devastating impact on my people's access to financial services. And you know, there are times where you see when there's money in the ATM, there's a run on the ATM where persons are withdrawing hundreds and thousands of dollars at a time. And Madam Speaker, given the fact that we also have government offices and corporations on the island and business houses that collect cash on a daily basis, I'm deeply concerned about that. There's a safety and security risk as well that we have to be cognizant of. So, Madam Speaker, I believe that the most viable banking option for the people of Long Island is for the Bank of the Bahamas to be domiciled on the island. At this juncture, we only left to rely on this publicly owned bank, which we believe will be mandated to provide a certain level of financial services, or should be mandated to provide a certain level of financial services to constituencies or communities such as mine in Long Island. You know, we have major resorts, we have businesses, government offices, corporations, elderly folks, visitors. And these persons all cannot be unbanked. Long Island cannot be financially excluded. And so if the BOB could be situated in Andros, Kemps Bay, and Mangrove Key, which have less people than us, and Bimini, Eleuthera, and Nagua, Sansal, Cat Island, all of whom have less people than us, Long Island, with its population, with our business engagement, and an economy that's bigger than a number of those islands that I named, should also have the BOB come to Long Island and set up shop. Having said that, I call on Scotiabank to urgently come and correct the situation with the ATM machine and seek to put in a second ATM machine, which would be helpful in terms of doing business on the island. So, Madam Speaker, I seek the government's intervention. The government's intervention assisting in ensuring that some form of banking is in place, the Bank of the Bahamas comes to the island, and that we have the ability to carry out some basic levels of commerce, okay, some basic levels of interacting with the banking system and getting some service. We are a part of the Bahamas, like every other island. Madam Speaker, we have another situation on the island, BTC. BTC is closed in Long Island. You know, a week or so ago, the last employee apparently resigned. And so we see, you know, we see what fire sales of government corporations can result in. And in hindsight, I think we all can see that that was one of the worst corporate mistakes in Bahamian history.
Did you say that?
Hindsight is 20/20. Fox Hill. The sale was indeed a mistake. And when we see resales of $1 billion, when we see monies just being extracted and no input, because if you look at the infrastructure in Long Island, the BTC infrastructure, it's deteriorating. Persons are unable to make simple phone calls. The internet is horrible. Persons now cannot go and pay their bills because the offices are all closed. And they have no employees on the island because the last employee was so overwhelmed, she resigned. So this is unacceptable. And this is why, Madam Speaker, I also have reservations about any slick privatization of BPL by breaking it into pieces. You see what happened with BTC. And we certainly would not want to see that recur with BPL. Madam Speaker, for some time, Bahamians have been dealing with astronomically high power bills. This has been of much concern to us. We have seen government entities, in fact, frankly, if you look at government entities across the country, I think BPL has the widest impact throughout the country, more than water and sewage, more than cable, more than anyone else. BPL, I believe, has the widest impact. And we know that the pain that consumers have experienced with their electricity bills and BPL service over the last few decades. However, Madam Speaker, these bills today, the electricity bill and the natural gas bill, both of which are more than 80 pages. I think the electricity bill is some 80, 81 or so pages, and the natural gas bill is about 85 pages. These are, frankly, half-baked. We are seeing, when you look at the electricity bill, what is tantamount to an overregulation of the energy sector. And frankly, Madam Speaker, I join the chorus in saying that more consultation is needed. You look at where IRCA is addressed in the bill. The reality is IRCA lacks the capacity to execute what is now required. They lack the expertise, the training, and the manpower. And so I'm curious as to whether this 3-year gap before IRCA will have oversight in this new electricity bill will allow them an opportunity to get up to speed. I think, Madam Speaker, to debate two heavy bills like this on the same day with 1 week's notice is ridiculous. And the question that arises is, what's the rush? What is the reason for the rush? The reality is, one of the reasons that BPL needs so much money is that the now PLP government hired scores and scores and scores and scores of people over the last 2 years, the last 2.5 years. After the F&M sought to reduce staffing, and I challenged the minister to say how much or how many persons, to reveal how many persons have been hired over the last 2.5 years, and what is the cost? What is the cost having hired those persons over the last 2.5 years? Madam Speaker, this bill purports to be a major overhaul, or to advance a major overhaul of the country's energy regulatory regime, and to provide a platform for rescuing BPL from its $1 billion debt. This bill purports to outsource the functions and assets to subsidiaries that are either entirely or partially owned by the government and others. And then you look at the natural gas bill, right? And you see similar language. Madam Speaker, whilst this bill repeals and replaces the existing Electricity Act passed in 2015, the reality is, when you look at Section 9, it is clear that this bill seeks to break BPL up, potentially break BPL up, and what could be 4 separate sections. One, generation, another for transmission and distribution, another for back office, billing functions, and another creating a foundation for public-private partnerships. That's the reality. If you look at Section 9, Madam Speaker, I believe that anyone who votes for this bill will have an atrocity on their conscience for the rest of their life. It is that bad, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, Madam Speaker, the reality is this bill seeks or allows for the formation of joint venture companies, but these companies will in large part likely not be owned by the Bahamian people. If you look at this bill, it speaks to, I want to go to Section 9(3)(c), which speaks to incorporating one or more 100% owned subsidiaries or joint venture companies, the latter part owned by government, to which is able to transfer functions and assets. Madam Speaker, these newly formed entities, which would be allowed to enter into management contracts with the system operator, appears, as I said earlier, to be outsourcing much of BPL's current functions, and frankly, much of the money-making parts of BPL. And what will be left will be a skeleton of what BPL is today. If you look at, you contrast Section 9(3)(c) of the bill today with Section 9(1) of the 2015 Act, it says that BPL itself will be wholly owned by or on behalf of the government of the Bahamas, entirely. This bill today proposes to bring forward subsidiaries that will only partially or even minimally be owned by government and the people of the Bahamas. Madam Speaker, the question is, when you look at this bill, how much, how many shares, what would be the remaining shares in these private companies that will be owned by the Bahamian public? Is it possible? How is it? Because frankly, what I'm seeing here, this bill is making it possible for BPL to transfer hundreds of millions of dollars of its property and land, much like what BTC did, with no returns, to private entities. You see where BTC was sold for some 200 million, and recently they sold it for $1 billion plus. And it's selling over and over and over. So our assets, the patrimony of the Bahamian people, how much of that we will end up owning after BPL is broken down into different entities. This bill also permits the transfer of assets without transferring the liabilities. I mean, that's the sweetest deal ever. Sweetest deal ever. You get to get all the generators, the buildings, the poles, underground network, the wiring, and all that is yours. But all the bills, you leave that to the Bahamian people. The liability is, you leave that to us. That makes no sense. That makes no sense. You're stripping BPL of its assets and leaving the Bahamian people with the liabilities. Madam Speaker, that is absurd and totally unacceptable. You know, I listened to the union president the other day, Kyle Wilson at BPL, and he was speaking about how BPL, or the union, he felt was not consulted, that the workers were frustrated and angry. And he used words like they felt betrayed, given that the governing Progressive Liberal Party and union leaders had entered into a memorandum of understanding ahead of the 2021 general election. So the question that remains is this: what will be happening with the workers' labor contracts? And how will this affect Mr. Wilson and Mr. Hannes and their members? Frankly, will there be a downsizing? Because if you're looking at breaking BPL into multiple entities, you obviously would have to downsize. So what happens there? You know, these questions are all very live questions that the Bahamian people should seek answers to. We want the answers to. There's no provision in the bill for the protection of employees of BPL. We do not see that. Okay, so how will they stay with a company that has no assets and only bills, and where the Bahamian people are forced to pay higher taxes and most likely higher electric bills? Madam Speaker, there's no provision to say that private owners will only be minority owners. A private owner can end up with 99% of any of the entities that BPL would be broken down into. And so what happens if the Clifton Pair plant, the Blue Hill plant, these generation plants are transferred to a private entity? Will the Bahamian people get a cent, 1 cent in return? When you think about these private entities, how could these private entities use our assets, our plants, to generate electricity, which they would then sell back to the skeleton of BPL for a profit? Imagine that. You get our assets, you leave us with the liabilities, you generate the power, and you sell it back to us for a profit. Nothing about that is a deal. Nothing about that. And so that's the worst kind of business practice you can find. And here again, the Bahamian people will lose. Here again, the people will lose. Okay? We will be paying more money for electricity that our own assets are being used to produce and then sell back to us. Imagine giving your house or something that you own to your friend for free, and then they charge you. Say, man, like, yeah, you can pay rent to live in my house, or your own house, you can pay rent. Or imagine lending me your car, Madam Speaker, or you give me your car, but I charge you when you won't come use your car. Just imagine that. Imagine, and you still paying the bank note for it as well, you know? Madam Speaker, this act does not require a private company to pay 1 cent to the Bahamian people. Not 1 cent to the Bahamian people. It does not require that, Madam Speaker. That is not a requirement set out in this piece of legislation. Madam Speaker, when I look at Section 54 of the bill, Section 54 does not speak, you know, they speak about procurement, but Section 54 does not speak about the procurement of partners. Okay? I see nowhere where the bill speaks to the procurement of joint partners. Nowhere. Nowhere. It does not speak to the procurement of joint partners, and that's a fact, as set out in the bill. Madam Speaker, I also see no provision in the bill for Bahamian citizens to have a guaranteed right to buy even a minimum amount of shares in any of the private entities that could emerge from the passage of the electricity bill. There's no provision in the bill for that, none whatsoever. So where would the Bahamian people who may wish to participate and buy shares in any of these entities have that opportunity to do so? Madam Speaker, to top it off, Madam Speaker, when we look at IRCA, we talk about IRCA giving, as we say in the Bahamas, a blight to BPL and any of these entities that arise, including some of the other power production entities in the country, because it'll have to apply to all. Apply for 3 years where they could set their own price. You set your price, and the public will have to pay for it. IRCA's supervisory rule will not kick in for 3 years. That's a lot of damage that could happen in 3 years. Okay, where entities are able to set and fix their own costs. So there are no safeguards in this bill, Madam Speaker, for the Bahamian people. None whatsoever. And that, Madam Speaker, is quite troubling. Quite troubling. If you look at Section 38(7), which speaks to IRCA, it says, subject to the approval of IRCA, a licensee may, where no undue preference is given to any class of customer or locality, fix the charges under this section at different rates and scales for different classes of customers, including residential, commercial, general service, and other service categories. So if you think about the Family Islands, with water and sewage, for example, there's a price for New Providence, and then there are prices for the Family Islands. And I believe that BPL may have a similar structure. But what happens now when all of these entities, Spanish Wells Power, BPL, Grand Bahama Power Company, other entities are able to set their own price? Will that seem, will we have that same approach where we look at Family Islands and say, you know what, we're going to give the Family Islands a break. You're on these hardship islands. What happens when everybody has a free fall for 3 years and IRCA has no say for 3 years? Madam Speaker, this is a recipe for disaster. Madam Speaker, with respect to Section 9 of the bill and any amendments to that section, if you look at Section 9(3)(c)(3), Section 9, subsection 3(c)(3) of the bill, I believe that can be amended by the insertion of the word liabilities immediately after the word functions. Okay, so Section 9, subsection 3(c)(3) can be amended by the insertion of the word liabilities immediately after the word functions. And if you look at Section 9(a), if you look at Section 9(3)(c)(4), another amendment, Madam Speaker, could be the addition of a new provision. Something like, provided that the government of the Bahamas shall own a minimum of 60% in any joint venture company that is incorporated pursuant to the provisions of Clause 9(3)(c)(2) hereof. And then you could do a subsection 2, that no asset of BPL shall be sold to any joint venture company that is incorporated pursuant to the provisions of Clause 9(3)(c)(2) hereof, unless a proportionate amount of the liabilities of BPL are transferred to that company at the time of the sale. And then another amendment, a third one, or a fourth one, if you will, a third one, that any joint venture company which any asset of BPL is transferred shall guarantee the continued employment of any employee of BPL who may be displaced as a result of the sale of that asset on the same or better terms as their employment was at BPL. And then lastly, Madam Speaker, that any sale of assets of BPL will be conducted by a transparent procurement process in which shares representing a minimum of 20% of the value of the asset is reserved for purchase by Bahamian citizens. Those are worthwhile amendments that the government, 5 amendments that the government could consider, adding liabilities and those 4 that I just mentioned. And I believe, Madam Speaker, they would assist and at least, if not entirely curing, but addressing some of the issues that we see and we find with this bill. Madam Speaker, you know, I noted the commentary of the member for Elizabeth when she talked about the legacy debt and the liabilities that BPL now faces. And I accept that. However, we cannot allow a situation, what has happened, it's already played out before our eyes with BTC, have a replay where the Bahamian people are at a loss, where we get less value for money, poorer service, and where the assets are all sold off at a fire sale with nothing in return to the public. And so, Madam Speaker, a few questions arise. How are these entities, these proposed entities, going to work in tandem with each other? To what extent will Bahamians, as I said earlier, be able to buy into any of these entities? Any of them? Madam Speaker, how are these entities? What arrangements are there between the transmission and distribution entity and an entity that may be responsible for generation? And what is the government's role in all of it? You know, what's going to be the share ownership structure? We want to know, because we ain't see no provision there in the bill. We are curious about these things because we do not wish to see any fire sale where the Bahamian people are at a loss and a few private operators and others walk off like fat cats. Madam Speaker, was a evaluation of BPL's assets done? I'm willing to bet if you go throughout the Family Islands, you look throughout New Providence, you factor in generation, distribution, and all that, BPL is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And so, if a valuation was done, what is the true value? And where is that valuation? Why hasn't that been tabled here in this place? I believe that this bill and the natural gas bill, but more particularly this bill, should sit in committee and not be passed today. That this bill should see proper consultation, that there should be amendments to proposed or to provisions in this bill to make this bill more acceptable, palatable to the Bahamian public, where we don't see a repeat of BTC I think it was 2011, of the BTC sale. So, Madam Speaker, those few words, I again urge the Bank of Nova Scotia to make it a priority to address the situation with the ATM in Long Island. And I again implore the government, I ask the government, I plead with the government on behalf of my people to bring the Bank of the Bahamas to Long Island. We're not asking for a bunch of branches. You can give us one branch so that we are not left unbanked, and that we, who also pay taxes in this country, we are some of the foremost business leaders in this country, that we have an opportunity to feel as if we are not excluded from what so many others are able to enjoy in this country. Madam Speaker, with those words, I rest. Thank you, Madam Speaker.